Mr. Moran.
Thank you. Mr. Redwine, in November of 2012, you were messaging with Elaine Hall, is that right?
Correct.
And you were saying things to her like, is there anything you want me to try to get out of him, right?
Yes, sir.
And that was with respect to try to get things out of your dad, right?
Correct.
And you were mentioning to her, he seems to want to talk and believes I'm supporting him, right?
Correct.
And what you were suggesting to her is that you were sort of laying in the weeds and trying to get information from him, right?
About Dylan, correct.
There was some discussion about the card that Mark had made up, and at the vigil that happened sometime around June 2012, Mark was giving those cards out at the vigil, right?
Correct.
And that was upsetting to Corey because the cards still said that Dylan was missing on it.
Correct.
And this was right after, like, the day after it became known that Dylan was in fact deceased, right?
Correct.
But what your dad was telling you was that people were asking him for those cards, right?
Correct.
And some of what your testimony was yesterday was that it seemed to you like Mark was just stoic and didn't really seem to care that his child was missing, right?
Correct.
But you would agree that your dad spoke, well, one, that your dad's sort of repetitive, right?
I understand what repetitive is. I'm not sure what you're meaning by that.
That the conversations you had leading up to June 2013 were similar subject matter. That
Correct.
The same things came up over and over again with your dad, right?
Correct.
And one of the things that came up with your dad over and over again was that he missed Dylan. Those were his words, right?
Yes, he did say that.
And you mentioned on direct, I believe, that you thought that it was just your dad trying to think of things that you wanted to hear, correct?
In a lot of our conversations, yes.
But you would been estranged from your dad for at least 10 years. Is that right? Is that what I heard on direct yesterday?
Correct.
You didn't really have much to hold it up against, right? You didn't have much to hold how he was acting in 2012 and early 2013 to anything because you hadn't been interacting with him. Is that right?
Correct. That's fair.
So when and part of your assessment was based on how he wasn't reacting in the way that you would. Is that right? That you thought you would have a different response, less stoic, if it was your child.
Yeah, that's how I feel.
But your dad did say, talked about how he had pictures of Dylan around in the house. Is that right?
I don't recall any comments about pictures in the house.
And were you ever in the house to see those pictures?
I was not.
Do you remember him saying things along the lines of, he's the love of my life, or my whole world revolved around my son?
He did make comments like that, yes.
And at one point, I'd gladly give my life so that he could have his. Remember your dad saying things like that?
I do remember that.
And he lamented that he and Elaine Hall could not put aside their differences to cooperate in finding Dylan. Do you remember him talking about that?
Yeah, we had several conversations like that.
And you're aware that he got a tattoo of Dylan's name on his arm, right?
I am aware of that.
And the way he talked about Dylan was that Dylan was a wonderful child. He was giving and funny, a good friend to his friends, and happy for the most part. You remember that?
Yes, sir.
And there was some discussion about the photographs. I think you referred to them as the porn pictures. Do you remember talking to Mark about that?
Yes, sir.
And he didn't fly into a violent rage, did he?
Not through. We were texting about that stuff, I believe.
Never had a conversation with him prior to June of 2013 about it on the phone?
I don't recall that conversation.
prior to June 2013, or in June 2013, do you remember your dad worrying over fuses cut at his house?
Objection relevant? Again, what's relevant to that?
This goes to the emotional response that Mr. Redwine's having, the fear he's experiencing, and gives more context for the reactions that that Nick Redwine noticed in him when they were having phone conversations prior to the end of June 2013.
I disagree. I think it's irrelevant.
There was mention of the discussion that it stood out to you where blunt force trauma was mentioned. You recall that part of the direct examination?
I do.
And you would agree that there were lots of discussions about what happened to Dylan, right?
Correct.
I mean, that's what you were calling about, was to get information about Dylan, right?
Correct.
And so that was an issue inserted into these conversations, and your father responded, right?
Correct.
And there was talk about how he could have been stabbed by a knife or shot or smashed in the head, right?
Correct.
And I know this isn't pleasant to talk about, but there was also a discussion of how there could have been a car accident, hit by a car, right?
Correct.
And the drunk drivers up in the area, that was discussed.
I don't remember drunk drivers specifically, but we did have those discussions.
Suffice to say that accident was discussed repeatedly.
Correct.
And bears, mountain lions, coyotes, abductions, all of those, right?
Correct.
Or that he tripped and fell and hurt himself, right?
Correct.
And you do recall is that that at one point you brought up plumbing pipes. Do you recall that?
I don't recall that.
You recall that in the discussion about blunt force trauma, pipes was referenced?
I don't recall pipes.
And do you remember your dad discussing the pain he felt around thinking about Dylan somewhere crying out for help and him not being able to respond?
He did make those comments.
There are, can you say how many recordings there are of conversations?
Objection, Your Honor.
I'm going to only inquire about the two that predate June.
Well, then you can talk about the two that predated June.
I think we know the answer.
When you met with your dad at the casino in, was it late November 2012?
Correct.
There was discussion about, as you pointed out on direct, being out there searching, looking for Dylan, right?
Correct.
And your father would talk to you about how law enforcement told him, no, you need to stay here in case he calls, in case he comes back, or in case he comes
Objection.
home, right?
Objection.
What's your objection?
Your Honor, this is specifically for the truth of the matter asserted. This is self-serving hearsay.
The purpose this is being introduced is to rebut the proposition that he didn't care and he didn't go out on searches, which has been presented throughout this trial. You're overruled.
You need me to repeat the question, sir?
Yes, sir.
Your father said, I wanted to be out looking for my son. I wanted to know what I could be doing to stay involved. But they kept telling me, no, you need to stay here in case he calls, in case he comes back, or in case he comes home. You recall that?
I do remember those conversations.
And you remember your dad saying exactly that.
Yes, sir.
And Corey agreed that he'd been told the same thing, right?
Yes, sir.
But what Corey said was that he snuck off, right? Didn't listen to the police when they instructed him.
Objection. Move to strike the last two comments and answers. Neither of those are indicative or probative of the topic.
Those are the only two questions I have on this specific topic, but it is probative in that multiple people were being told, don't interfere with law enforcement.
I'm going to sustain the objection. I think that actually came out through law enforcement, that was the general rule. At least it's search and rescue, if I remember correctly.
Okay. I'll confine it then to,
I think you need to confine it to things Mr. Redwine told Mr. Redwine.
sure. You remember that your dad said that he needed to be at the house and be available in case Dylan was trying to reach out to somebody, right?
I do remember
And
that.
that was something law enforcement wanted him to do.
Yes, sir.
And your dad said that he struggled with that, but he was going to comply, right?
He did.
You remember that your father at that casino meeting was talking about how he was having a hard time functioning, that he was struggling to function.
He did say that.
And at that conversation, he talked about the worry that Dylan had got hit by a car.
I don't recall that.
To refresh your recollection, to take a look at the transcript.
Yes, sir.
May I approach?
You may.
Page.
Yes, he did say that.
And in those early days, he was talking about how at first he was just thinking or hoping that maybe Dylan lost track of time or wasn't paying attention, right?
Yes, he did.
And you recall that at the casino meeting, your dad was talking about how he'd been trying to get away from work that required him to travel so much.
Objection.
So
This is prior to Dylan disappearing on November 19th.
the reason he wanted to get away from traveling so much was so he could be home more for his child, that the prosecution has suggested Mr. Redwine didn't care about.
I am going to limit it to the time after Dylan disappeared. I think that's the appropriate time frame. I mean, there's been evidence that they did things together, they went on trips together just shortly before the Dylan's disappearance, so I think we're going to limit it to that.
So, with respect to after Dylan's disappearance, as discussed at the casino meeting, your dad was saying he was not doing a very good job or having a hard time taking care of himself.
Correct.
That he was getting very little sleep.
Correct.
That he was getting very little sleep because he was trying to rack his brain, trying to figure out anything that could help, right?
Yes.
And that he said, and please forgive my language here, but, quote, I'm on the verge of a fucking mental breakdown.
Correct.
Switching gears a little bit here, this is the conversation that you and your father had June 30th, 2013. This is right around the time of the vigil.
Objection. Beyond scope. Talked about this several times already.
Isn't this beyond the scope, Mr. Moran?
No, this is the discussion about the vigil that was raised by the prosecution on direct examination.
No, it was not. We talked about Mr. Brandon Redwine attending a vigil in February. There was never any discussions about other vigils after the 30th. Vigil in February was not, it was prior to the knowledge that Dylan had been deceased. This is a separate vigil.
I'm going to sustain that objection then.
Um,
Our earlier conversations?
Sure. Well, then with respect to the February vigil, you remember that that your father was received with hostility.
I didn't necessarily see a lot of hostility. You know, there were people that avoided Mark, but they just didn't want to go through that interaction, I guess.
You didn't see people glaring and throwing shoulders?
I did not know.
Do you remember after the February vigil talking about that with your dad?
About how he felt people were glaring at him.
And being pushy?
Objection, Judge. This is not probative of the purpose to rebut any allegations of indifference that Mr. Redwine's already testified about on his father's behalf.
Your Honor, if I may, the reason that's important is because there have been representations from the prosecution that Mr. Redwine wasn't participating in things, but when those things involved the posts throwing shoulders and glaring and being hostile.
I'll let you ask the question.
Do you need to repeat the question?
Yes, please.
So there was hostility, at least that your father described to you,
Correct.
and it extended to people initiating physical contact with your father.
I don't remember any conversations about physical like they were glaring at him is how he felt.
And jostling him and throwing shoulders, right?
Correct.
A moment, please. Thank you, sir. That's all I have, Your Honor.
Redirect. Thank you. You testified on direct examination that in those early days after Dylan disappeared, you were frustrated with Mr. Redwine because he wasn't doing anything. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you also described how he would talk a lot, but that you didn't see the follow-through. Is that correct?
That's correct. That was a lot of the frustration that I was having and just trying to figure out, like, we say it, but we don't do it.
Right. And when you met with him at the casino, as counsel has described, that was one of the purposes of the meeting for both you and for Corey, right?
Correct. We just wanted to get out there and do something. So we definitely had that conversation about let's make a plan.
And why did you feel like you needed to tell those things to Mr. Redwine, to Mark Redwine?
Your Honor, pardon me, sir. This is just retreading direct examination, so we would object as to asked and answered.
Okay, you're overruled. Go ahead.
Why did you feel like you needed to spur him or cajole him into doing something?
There just wasn't ever any action in, we could talk about something, but I remember having conversations. Mark had asked, what would I be doing? I'd stand on the rooftops, I'd be shouting, where is my son? Just try to get that figured out. And I had that conversation with Mark a lot, and just, we're saying it, we're just not doing it.
Objection, Your Honor. Move to strike. What somebody else would do in the circumstance doesn't have anything to do with Mr. Redwine's response.
Okay, you're overruled.
Is that part of why you encouraged him to appear on the Dr. Phil show?
That is just, that's something that we could reach millions of people, and that was a good opportunity to get the fact that Dylan was missing out there for the world to see.
He was reluctant about it, right?
There was some resistance in it. Yeah.
And other times, things like, you know, appearing on a news show, those sorts of things, right? And we're talking, again, just specifically about the date range prior to June 27th. It was early days. Did you have to push him to do these activities?
We did, and that was a source of frustration because we're pushing to find his son, obviously my brother, but we didn't feel like we ever got that reaction, like we have to do something.
And he even admitted that during the casino meeting, didn't he?
He did.
What sorts of things was he saying about his own inaction, if you recall?
What I recall is he felt that there was a lot of resistance from Elaine and how she was doing things, and it didn't match what Mark wanted to do. He wanted to do something. He just, again, never followed through with that. So we had a lot of conversations about we just have to get out there and do something. Elaine, she's doing her own thing. It doesn't mean you can't do your thing.
And counsel asked you a lot about sort of some of the things that he said about how he felt pain that Dylan was missing and worried, those sorts of things. Did you see the expected emotions that would be appropriate or accompany that from your perspective?
No, from my perspective, we talked about it.
Speculation.
Just a second. Overruled.
Did you see the expected emotions that you would thought would come with those kinds of statements?
I did not. It felt like it was just said because we were expected to hear it.
And counsel asked you about this conversation on June 27th, where Mr. Redwine was talking about, as counsel stated, whether Dylan had been shot, stabbed, or smashed in the head, or other mechanisms could have caused his death. Did you see the expected emotion to go along with those concepts?
I did not. To me, if I'm talking about my son, somebody that I care about, I wouldn't just be saying trip and tell. There'd be some type of, I would have expected some type of emotional reaction, like sadness or anything like that.
Again, this is just hours after he found out that Dylan was dead.
Correct.
And counsel brought up the statements about blunt force trauma. Who is the person that brought up the concept first of blunt force trauma in your conversations with Mark Redwine?
That was Mark.
On June 27th.
That was Mark.
How many times did he say it?
I'd say about 4 or 5 times.
Thank you. No further questions.
Anything from the jury? Okay, can I see counsel just real quick? So, Mr. Redwine, you may be called back later in the trial. Because of that, you're still under the sequestration order, and one of the investigators from the prosecution will explain to you what that means.
Okay.
So, you can step down. But it means you can't stay in the courtroom. One of the things it means. You can't stay in the courtroom is one of the things it means. You have to leave the courtroom. And also talk to Mr. King about contact information. He's going to go outside with you also from the other side. Oh, wait, bring that piece of paper back, that belongs to Mr. Moran. Thank you. Thank you, Aaron. Yeah.